Chapter 5, looking at the American Revolution, is going to be our first chapter that's starting into period 3, which covers 1754 to 1800, which is essentially going to be the foundation of the United States as a country. It's going to look at the lead up to the Revolutionary War, the war itself, and then the early stages of establishing a government through the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and a bit beyond that. So Chapter 5 in particular is going to look at the lead up to and the fighting of the American Revolution. Question number 1 is asking, what were the roots and significance of the Stamp Act controversy? So first of all, you have to think back to the French and Indian War, which really should mark the beginning of period 3, but that we already covered in looking at the end of period 2. But the French and Indian War began as a conflict over the Ohio River Valley between the British and the French. In the end, the British win, and the French are forced to give up their North American empire. And you can see the before and after here on the map. After the war is over with, keep in mind that the British draw the proclamation line from the Proclamation of 1763 that prevents, or is supposed to prevent, colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And it was intended to reduce conflict with Native Americans. However, many colonists ultimately ignore that. So to understand the Stamp Act controversy, we just have to understand that it directly spirals out of the French and Indian War and its aftermath. After the war, the British expected that the colonies pay back the debt that was accrued from actually fighting the war. The British also made efforts to rule the colonies more directly. And the colonists, of course, balk at this, especially because they have no representation in Parliament. So they are going to be directly controlled by the government and subject to new, higher taxes to pay for the war, even though they have no say in their own government because they have no seats in Parliament. Parliament, however, will claim that they have something called virtual representation. And this is the idea that all members of the British Empire are represented in Parliament, even if they don't have an actual seat. So members of Parliament are theoretically supposed to represent the interests of the entire empire. So therefore, the British colonists in the Americas are indirectly represented through this concept of virtual representation. So British efforts to increase taxes on the colonies to pay for the French and Indian War and to exert more administrative authority over the colonies began with the passage of the Sugar Act in 1764. Interestingly, the Sugar Act actually reduced the price of sugar, or in this case, molasses. So it wasn't actually an increase in taxes. But what made it controversial was that it first strengthened smuggling restrictions in order to try to stop colonists from avoiding the navigation acts as they had done for so many years. And it also, secondly, strengthened British Admiralty courts by taking away the jury and allowing cases to be decided by a judge alone, and many colonists felt that this was a violation of their rights under English law. But of course, the most important effort is the Stamp Act, which is passed by Parliament in 1765. The Stamp Act is actually the first direct tax on the colonies, and it required all printed documents like newspapers, court documents, deeds, etc. to carry a stamp that had to be purchased from the government. The money raised was used in part to pay back the debt from the French and Indian War, and also used in part to support a British army that would be permanently stationed in the 13 colonies. The colonists who rejected that idea of virtual representation decried this taxation without representation. This becomes a rallying cry for many colonists, and the Stamp Act itself really acts to unite many colonists in opposition to the British government. Many colonists formed the so-called Stamp Act Congress, in which 9 colonies sent delegates or representatives. And the Stamp Act Congress, while they did pledge allegiance to the crown or the king, as well as Parliament, they did reject these taxes that were being issued to them without their consent. And they organized and launched a boycott of British imports, sometimes called the non-importation movement, because they were refusing to import British goods, until this act was repealed. They also formed so-called committees of correspondence, and these committees of correspondence were formed in different colonies in order to communicate and to coordinate resistance to the Stamp Act. Resistance to the Stamp Act also sees popular crowd demonstrations that were led by groups like the Sons of Liberty. And ultimately, under pressure from this non-importation movement and from these crowd demonstrations, Parliament will actually repeal the Stamp Act. However, along with that repeal, Parliament will pass what's called the Declaratory Act, in which Parliament declares that they have the right to make laws for the colonies even if those colonies don't have a seat in Parliament.